Ladies and gentlemen, how did we lose the trust of the people, and how are we going to win it back? I've got two wonderful speakers to answer this question today for you, eminently qualified because they represent the two least trusted groups, politicians and journalists. I've got Mark Thompson and Shami Chakrabarti. So Shami is a politician for the UK Labour Party, the main opposition party, the left-wing opposition party in the UK. And Mark Thompson, of course, is the CEO of the New York Times. There's nothing like grilling your boss on stage and making him squirm. I'm going to kick it off with a quick warm-up question. Mark, why should anybody trust the New York Times? We got the Iraq war wrong. We got Trump wrong.
Well, okay, three reasons. Firstly, it's the point of the New York Times. We've got 170 years of trying, sometimes failing, you're right, but trying to do without fear or favor journalism. And anyone who reads the newspaper, let alone coming in to see us, it's the point. It's in Aristotelian terms, it's the telos. It's the whole point of the Times to do it. Secondly, unlike many news organizations, we still really invest in it. We've got a newsroom as big now as it was 20 years ago. We have 1,400 people in our newsroom trying to get it right. But the third thing, maybe the most important, is we're accountable. If you don't like what we've done, you can find us, you can sue us. Sarah Palin's just tried to do that without success, by the way, but you can come after us, you can criticize us, and when we get things wrong, you can, in a million places in the internet, you can find it. So essentially, tradition and a real sense of belief in the organization, genuine investment in proper, old-fashioned professional journalism, but also the fact that you can, unlike so many sources of news now, you can find us.
We'll come back to this in a second, but Shami, very quickly, why should we trust the Labour Party? I mean, your campaign against Brexit last year was so poor, you practically won it.
Why should you trust the Labour? I mean, I'm not a great one for blind trust in any institution. So the sorts of characteristics that I think lend themselves to trust are things like accountability, in our case, democratic accountability. We're now, I think, the most populous political party in Europe, with well over 500,000 members. And the current leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is trying to restore democracy to policy formulation and so on. But I think transparency is really important. The historic mission of the Labour Party, since the 1900s is pretty transparent. It's for a more equal United Kingdom and world. And our tensions, discussions, debates, and let's face it, at times even divisions are transparent. And I think when you're trying to build trust in any institution, transparency is probably quite key.
So one sort of common thread between the sort of mainstream politicians and the mainstream media in this day and age is that in some ways, perhaps you fail to read your countries at certain points. I mean, maybe starting with you, Mark, you used to be Director General of the BBC before you came to the New York Times. You know Britain very well, you know the US very well. How much responsibility do you think for the rise of populism and populist sentiment in those two countries lies with news organizations like the BBC and the New York Times who fail to read some of the people in the country?
Well, the task, the fundamental journalistic task of listening and trying to understand what's happening is a profoundly imperfect activity. And it seems to me that one of the most important things is not to overstate what journalism can do. Everything happens in real time. Continuities, periods in history where the same kind of stuff keeps on happening, is relatively easy for reporters to capture because your past knowledge of what happened last year helps you cover this year. And we're going through a transitional period with profound social, technological, ideological change happening in our countries. And we're seeing moments of discontinuity which politicians and journalists both find it really hard to predict. And I think we're going through a period where the predictive power of journalism has been shown sometimes to be faulty. I mean, some people, as it happens, for example, I personally very strongly believed that Donald Trump was going to win, but I found myself in a minority both in the Times and more generally amongst all of my friends. But I think that trying to learn and then trying to understand from our mistakes is part of what good journalists do. I think we shouldn't think of journalism as a science. I think it's more like a real-time iterative activity where you just have to go learn from your mistakes.
Are there some concrete things that you can do to learn from mistakes? I mean, I'm thinking, in our newsroom, for example, I mean, I remember well, we had a correspondence meeting in London earlier this year. It was basically all the correspondents from Africa and Europe and a bunch of editors from New York. And at dinner at night, there was one editor who had a husband who had voted for Trump. Now, everybody crowded around. There was this one person who had a direct link to a Trump voter. And it brought home to me that we are, in our own way, a very homogeneous organization. And in some ways, that makes the deep listening that you're talking about harder. Yeah. Should we diversify our newsrooms beyond gender and minorities?
Yes. So we should. I mean, firstly, from a commercial point of view, we are becoming, and we want even more to become, a news provider for the whole world. And if you want to reach and understand the whole world, that better influence who you have inside your own organization. You want to reflect the range of different cultures. But I think politically as well, I'm very proud of the way we cover politics, and I'm very proud of the opinion we do. I want to applaud the fact that recently our editorial page editor James Bennett, who's here, decided to go to the Wall Street Journal and hire one of their most brilliant, but decidedly, by most people's standards, conservative writers, Bret Stephens, to enrich and broaden the perspective of the opinion pages of the New York Times. So I think diversity of opinion, we know that having a diverse group of journalists debating what our stance on a particular topic should be or how we're going to cover a particular story enriches the conversation and gets a better result. So I think very definitely news organizations need to guard against monoculture, where in the end, in the classic behavioral psychology sense, you get a groupthink. You get everyone kind of agreeing with each other. And the best journalism is essentially a kind of room of reporters and editors disagreeing with everyone, and in a hope that in that kind of dialectical struggle that you get closer to the truth.
Shami, you were a member of the Levinson inquiry, which is an inquiry that took place in Britain after the phone hacking scandal. It took a deep look at what was wrong and right, possibly, with the British media. I mean, are you content that now the British media is helping democracy or hurting democracy, or are you not sure?
Well, I don't want to do the kind of Trump-style media bashing. I mean, here's the problem. On the one hand, we must always be skeptical, curious, combative even, to keep democracy alive. We mustn't have blind trust in any institution, political institution, media institution, economic institution. On the other hand, if you tear down trust in institutions altogether, you cannot have civilization, let alone democracy. So certainly in the United Kingdom, in recent years, say over the last 10 years, we've had massive crises in trust in institutions. In the government over the Iraq war that you mentioned, and the security services, etc., etc. In the banking system, my goodness, over the financial crisis. Even in the media, in journalists who are supposed to help citizens understand what's going on, we had the phone hacking scandal. And on one level, it's great that these things have exposed problems in the institutions. On the other hand, if there's no trust in those institutions, there is the danger of what you've called populism. Now, popular democracy and skepticism and activism is a wonderful thing, but populism as you coined it, is something a little bit more scary. Now, what's the difference between the two? I think the difference between the two is functioning institutions, the rule of law, internationalism, participatory democracy, rather than, people taking to the streets in a less than peaceful way.
The media has not always been terribly nice to Jeremy Corbyn, who is the leader of the UK Labour Party.
Well, the media is not a monolith, right? So that's why I don't say the media good, the media bad. The media is so diverse in Britain and in the world.
But I would argue the media has been very broadly cynical about Jeremy Corbyn until recently, and that has been actually fairly. I'm wondering what you think about that. Do you think that they were being unfair and there was a group thing?
There is no doubt in my mind that certain newspapers, in particular, those great British institutions, newspapers. There's no doubt in my mind that newspapers in Britain were, for the most part, very, very anti-Jeremy Corbyn, okay? And they have policies. Mark comes from the BBC, which has a policy of independence and neutrality and trying to be fair. Though even David Dimbleby said during the election campaign that the BBC had not been fair to Jeremy. But the BBC tries to be fair. The Times, for example, or The Guardian, or whichever newspaper, they have policies. And they back certain candidates, even within a political party, let alone in a general election. For the most part, the print media was against Jeremy. The BBC attempted fairness. It didn't always succeed. But the beauty of a general election campaign in the United Kingdom is that the BBC in particular works even harder during a general election campaign to give a fair amount of time, for example, to different candidates. And we have no doubt in the British Labour Party that extra neutrality helped us. Yeah. We don't want special treatment. We just want a fair hearing,
I think this is an interesting point, actually, because, this sort of claim to be impartial or neutral, I think, of course I'm not allowed to have opinions, but, can be construed as being unrealistic. I mean, to be fair is one thing. But, as a former BBC man, do you think the BBC sometimes leads this ad absurdum that, on Brexit, for example, that it simply didn't call out some of the lies in the strictest sense that it should have?
So many people feel that. I mean, they sort of feel, honestly, that the BBC was too fair in the campaign, and this is largely Remainers who felt that the result was the wrong result, and it must be somebody's fault, and the BBC shouldn't have given equal time to the Brexit argument as it did to the Remain argument. That's really an attack on democracy, actually. I mean, the point about the BBC is that this is really about, in the context of debates and coverage, allowing equal exposure to different politicians.
Even if they're lying?
Well, I think I want to say is, in elections, it's for the public to decide who's telling the truth and who's lying, and exposing the public to different political candidates to make up their own judgment of what's going on is kind of, what happened at the Assembly down the road in this city 2,500 years ago. That's how democracy works. Can I make I want to make another point just on, which is to say this: I think something particular and negative is happening in Western countries, but particularly in the UK, actually. I think a lot of British journalism has moved from healthy skepticism, which is what you want from all journalists, to really deep cynicism. And at a time when political discourse is also the kind of presumption of good faith. You give your opponent a chance to speak, you don't demonize them, has gone as well. I think that the politicians and the media have between them talked down politics as a profession. They're all liars, you can't trust any of them. And I think between the media and politicians, we taught the public to distrust everyone and to be cynical about everything. And we're reaping the reward of having done that right now. And I think that's particularly true in the UK, where there's really quite a dark culture of public life in many ways. But I think it's true in America and other countries as well.
It's a very difficult thing for a news organization, and I guess also for a political party, to deal with lies. Right? How do you deal with lies? How do you deal with a central campaign pledge in Britain, for example, that leaving the European Union will provide the health service with £350 million a week?
Yeah.
plastered on a bus, and by now the chief strategist of the Leave campaign has admitted that without that claim, they would not have won. Now, that claim was widely reported, occasionally qualified, eventually perhaps refuted, but there is that issue of confirmation bias and of just repeating that same information, reinforcing the lies. How do we deal with that? How do we report lies?
I want to say, I think we just got to be careful. I mean, that was what I would describe as a preposterous campaign promise, something which was never going to happen. That is ubiquitous in political campaigns in Western societies. Almost all politicians have in their party programs proposals which you understand kind of what the sentiment behind the proposal is and the kind of direction of it, but it's ridiculous. And they always get walked back in government. Once you've won, the political party then starts sort of denying or edging away from the promise. There were plenty of things said by the Remain campaign which have turned out not to be true. We were told that the United Kingdom economy was going to collapse within a week of the vote. It just didn't happen. That wasn't true either. And
it might yet happen.
If you start calling everything out as a lie when a campaign says something which may not happen, you're going to be...
Shami, do you want to come in on this?
You said you didn't want us to agree too much. I agree with all of that, but it's not the whole story. We mustn't fall into a sort of elitist trap of saying good journalism and good Oxford Union debate will solve the problem. One of the problems, if not the greatest problem, is rising inequality. 8 men on the planet own as much wealth as 3.6 billion people, and inequality is getting greater, not smaller, not lesser at this moment in the 21st century, and that's going to lend itself to distrust, even with the best journalism in the world, even with the best political discourse in the world. And that has been going on for like 30 years. And if you don't address that, and that lends itself to what you might call populism, or I might call radicalism, and which way is it going to go? Is it going to go Trump? Is it going to go Corbyn? Which is better, which is worse? Now, I know what I think. I think we need greater equality, but we also need to rebuild the institutions you're talking about and rebuild trust in them.
But I mean, politicians who want to bring about greater equality will then have to talk honestly about the sacrifices and the costs of that. And the question is, does the Labour Party, by simply promising to do away with tuition fees and, forgive all the student debt, that's £100 billion. Nobody knows how to pay for that. And exactly those kind of promises that won't be kept and build the distrust.
I would argue that we worked really hard to attempt to cost those promises. And they were, the costings were set alongside the promises. And then it's for journalists and others to say, oh, you got your maths right or wrong, But we've been making the case for tax, possibly for the first time in many years. This Labour Party that I've joined, I'm very new to party politics. I was on the side of the Angels just a couple of years ago. I was a human rights campaigner. I didn't have to get my hands dirty, but I chose to get my hands dirty because in the end I'm a Democrat, and anti-politics is not going to work. So yes, I think Mark's got a point. We can debate whether we got our maths right or whether you think our proposals are cost not, but we're not lying. We're asking people to make choices about the kind of society that they want, and we are saying the wealthy need to pay more tax, or some tax. We've got international institutions that are global capital that are completely unaccountable, and we're saying they should be accountable at least for tax.
And there are lies. There are lies. We last summer, or rather, I'll give you one example. In the aftermath of the election, the American President Donald Trump, or the president-elect, said there had been voter fraud to the extent of 3 million votes. The implication being that essentially in African-American wards, illegal and fake votes for Hillary Clinton had distorted the popular vote. Simply not true. The New York Times, Dean McKay and his colleagues, the editor, decided it must have been completely clear to Donald Trump it was untrue. We called it a lie. we called it a lie. So there are lies. I would distinguish between fanciful promises given in the heat of a campaign and something which is not true. The president also lied and continues to lie about the New York Times. And we're not an opposition party, but when somebody lies about us, we put the record straight.
Let me just, this is interesting. I mean, we can almost see it in real time. Every time, the president calls the New York Times the failing New York Times, our subscriptions pretty much go up. So this is another interesting question. How does it make you feel, the fact that actually Donald Trump has been pretty good news for us?
Well, I mean, isn't it just a basic fact of life, which is, bluntly, that bad news is our business? I mean, in the broader sense, controversy, political battles, crises, even, terrible natural disasters are things which people like to consume, they like to watch and read about and talk about. And there's a kind of economic reality to the consequences of that. I mean, what I want to say, what I think is very good about what's happening right now is that certainly in the United States, the importance of journalism and of good journalism is clearer now, I think, to more people than it's been for decades. And there's been a kind of clarification of why countries need really strong journalistic institutions. And the extraordinary thing about the US at the moment is, I mean, I became inspired to become a journalist at the age of kind of 14 or 15, watching coverage and reading about Watergate in the UK. And the two news organizations I was reading about were the New York Times and the Washington Post. And you move 4 decades into the future, in a moment where we told that's all over, it's going to be BuzzFeed, it's going to be the Huffington Post, it's going to be Vice, and the two institutions who are doing the best work and being seen to do the best work in ways which are playing a really important part in democracy are the Times and the Post again.
I'm going to open this up to questions in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to finish off by just bringing this topic to the changing times. Those days, yes, you would have a front page of a mega newspaper like the New York Times, and that would be the national conversation. I mean, Arthur Miller said, a good newspaper is like the nation having talking to itself. Now, with Facebook and other social media sort of distributing sometimes real news, sometimes fake news, sometimes real lies, I mean, how do we deal with that? Is it enough to have just a lot of good journalism combating that, or do we actually need some kind of, do we need to put pressure on these platforms to do something about it?
Well, I would put pressure on the platforms to deal with hate and bullying and trolling, particularly of women, which has got to quite astonishing levels.
Not fake news.
I think it's tricky to get, you've got to be, I'm a free speech advocate, and that's so vital to democracy. I think the way to deal with it is with trusted voices and trusted brands. People have got tons of information. Everybody's a citizen journalist now. Everyone that's tweeting is arguably a citizen journalist. But what you have to do if you have a great brand like the BBC or the New York Times is to maintain trust in your brand, and people in difficult times will go looking for that trusted voice, even in the maelstrom of voices.
Can you take this? I mean, I get the freedom of speech thing for sure, and I think that the state should not get involved. But our own organization, for example, when we, for example, run ads that deny climate change, in our paper, where we would never write a story that does such a thing, how is it right to profit from climate change denial in our own pages when, I mean, that's a place where we could actually act differently.
Well, I mean, I'm very, very suspicious of the instinct to suppress debates.
But advertise, I mean.
Well, there is a real debate about climate change which has not been won. And one thing, like many people of my class and age, I absolutely accept the scientific consensus about climate change myself. You've got to accept that many, many millions of people, tens of millions of people in the Western world do not accept it. There is still a live political debate about it, and our policy on taking advocacy advertising is not to only take advocacy advertising from one side of a given debate. And I think that instinct, which is, if you can stop people talking, you'll solve the problem. If you can stop racist commentary, racism will disappear. If you can just stop people talking about vaccine safety, everyone will believe in vaccine safety. I would just say, as a matter of fact, that's a conjecture about human nature, which has turned out to be false. And things like political correctness may have made the things they're trying to make better worse.
The lady in the third row there. Could we have a mic, or maybe not? Just if you stand up and, oh, there's a mic coming your way. Sorry, there's a mic just behind you. Sorry about that.
Thank you. This is for Ms. Chakrabarti. You started by saying that the Labour Party has become the most populist party in Europe.
I think so. I may be wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then you went on to say that populism is scary. So should we be scared of the Labour Party in the UK?
No. What I tried to do, obviously unsuccessfully, was to perhaps try and make a distinction between what Katrin had called populism and what I would call popular democracy. Right? So what is the difference between a great, strong, democratic group or society or majority on the one hand and mob rule on the other hand? What is the difference between those two concepts? For me, the difference between those two concepts, one which is scary and the other which is inspiring, is to some extent democratic institutions, but even before democratic institutions, the rule of law, human rights, those instincts and those values make for civilization one, and then for democracies. That's the difference between obeying mob and a popular democracy.
We've got another question there.
Hi, about the global change debate. If I want to advertise within the New York pages, would I put evolution debate as if I'm anti-evolution? It's a debate too.
What was the...
So I think the question is, would you take an ad that denies the theory of evolution?
I think it would depend on precisely how it was put. I think we'd need to believe that there was, as it were, a completely live current political debate for us to want to think of it as an advocacy ad. There are limits. I mean, I'll give you an example of areas where we are very cautious. Highly emotive topics, claimed genocides in the past, where the actual underlying substance of the debate is itself about human suffering, and where there are potential victims or families of victims still alive, we are very cautious. So there certainly are limits. I don't believe we've ever had a request for an ad claiming that Charles Darwin is wrong. I suspect the people who believe that don't
Maybe you should try.
The New York Times. Maybe you should have a go, yeah.
But this is really interesting, though, because it's about money. I mean, advertising is one aspect of it, but ownership of media outlets is another aspect of it. My sort of instinctive arguments about have more debate, not less of it, are great, but there isn't a level playing field, because in the world there isn't a level playing field. And so some people can buy the ads, some people can own the newspapers, and other people can't.
I mean, there's a fundamental question.
There's a very interesting complication there, don't you think, which is that social media has essentially, to some extent, and I think in some ways, in a good as well as sometimes troubling way, has opened things up.
Yeah.
And it's possible for pressure groups who do not have the money to place ads in the New York Times or whatever, still to get their message across by effective leveraging of social media. And we tend to have complicated views about that. I mean, we might be in principle in favor of the democratization of opinion, but troubled with the adverse results of that, which is there's a lot of craziness and hate out there as well. But each case needs to be considered on its own merits, but my basic view is public debate about almost any topic is better than attempts to suppress. And I get very worried about the instinct to kind of almost ask Facebook to kind of borrow software from Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping to start shutting down
they could hire
content which
editors.
Somebody thinks is bad.
They could start by hiring editors, and you could say that we'll never get there, but maybe doing something is better than doing nothing. Anyhow, we must leave it here. Unfortunately, this is flashing red at me. The good news is there's going to be a session that pretty much continues the conversation. You're going to have another chance to ask questions afterwards. We are now going to have a presentation by Dr. Philipp Fernbach on basically confirmation bias and why lies actually are pretty stubborn and stay with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.